Today, we're honoring the idea that anything is possible during the next few months of the NFL offseason by handing out some Valentines for our favorite potential fits. Let's get after it. Free agency in the NFL draft right around the corner, obviously, but Dwain, no man, I would argue in either is going to be a bigger, just overall news item than Mr. T. Higgins. So potential Valentine from none other than Patriots QB1 Drake Maye. Dear Pats, I would love you forever if you got me T. Higgins. Look, we could say go back to Cincy. We can name any team in the NFL because let's face it, they would all be better with T. Higgins. But man, Dwain, just looking at again, all the poorest just overall supporting cast arguments we can make for Drake Maye and the Patriots. No offense out there, I do believe, could use a true number one wide receiver more than the Patriots.
Yeah, I mean, and T. Higgins really is like the jewel of this wide receiver class as far as free agency goes because he's a good player, but he's also young, right? He's in his prime. A lot of these other guys that you could add to your team, Stephon Diggs, Amari Cooper, I do think those guys could find fit somewhere, and we'll talk about some of them later, but T. Higgins is the guy that, right, he is at his absolute peak powers of ability. So, yeah, if you could get him and bring him to, New England, I would be down with that. This is a guy that had his best target share year, 23% this year, targets per route run, also a career high, sitting at 23%. He's a guy that, he's not like a burner or anything, Ian. He's more of a possession if you had to put him on the spectrum of like possession versus big play. But he still does come up with those big plays. And is a guy that can be a monster, right? He can be a terror once you get him down inside the 10-yard line. You give him those end zone targets. So, yeah, I think he would be a huge addition for the Patriots. Anyone needing – look, T. Higgins is going to be a big addition for any team. They can go get it. But I think you immediately, when you talk about a player like him, you got to start looking at the teams that actually have the money. And the Patriots do have the most cap space, and they got the young quarterback, so I think it makes a lot of sense. Obviously, the Raiders sitting there with a lot of money, but they don't have their quarterback yet. What are they going to do? I know Raiders is a team that you want to talk about here in a minute. The other interesting would be potentially Commanders, but, yeah, really interested in your thoughts. I do think if he lands with the Patriots, I am curious how high you would immediately rank T. Higgins. Would you give him wide receiver 1 status in the ranks?
That is the major question. We just saw him rip off a top 6, per game kind of season, even as the, Robin to Jamar Chase's Batman and Cincy, albeit that was also with, Joe Burrow, giving him some of the best quarterback play in the league. So 26 in January, as you mentioned, we are not dealing with, an aging wide receiver here by any stretch. But I do wonder, Dwain, if these, again, more possession types, more big bodied, I'm going to just out physical you down the field types. I don't want to just, be the boy who screamed Kenny Galladay out here or anything, but we have seen these guys fall off a bit more often. Do you think there could be some risk with, again, maybe us over, stating him going to another team? Because let's face it, Joe Burrow and that Bengals offense, one of the more fantasy-friendly situations in the league.
Yeah, and that's why I ask, because I think he would still be more of a borderline wide receiver 1 for me. I don't think this move would get him into the top just because, A, leaving Joe Burrow, even though you've got to deal with Jamar Chase on the other side of you, getting to play in that offense, I don't know that necessarily getting to be the absolute number 1 on another team would be that much of an upgrade, right? If any, I think it's probably almost neutral, but I am a little bit more, positive on T. Higgins as far as, like my outlook on him after the season that he had. If you go back to him as a prospect, he was a lot better than a guy like Kenny Galladay. What I wonder is, like, could he ascend to being more like a Brandon Marshall if he truly was like the funnel guy where everything is coming to him? Because we have seen teams in the past that get innovative and the right kind of quarterback, a quarterback that's just willing to put the ball on his wide receiver, whether or not he thinks he's covered or not, has that my ball mentality. T. Higgins definitely checks those boxes. I think the biggest concern would be under a really heavy workload like that. T. Higgins is just not a guy that's been able to stay healthy. Like he's pretty much dinged up every single season and often multiple times in the same season. So I do wonder, would he be able to hold up to like this massive target volume? Obviously, injuries are this thing that we don't try to pretend that we can predict, but this is a guy that's dealt with a lot of little small nagging injuries here or there, and it does seem to impact his performance. Obviously, he's been, courageous. He's come out there and, tried to be the decoy in several games, as fantasy managers know. I'm sure many of you are rolling your eyes listening or watching this right now because you had that T. Higgins dud. Oh, you got to play him. You got to play him if he's out there. 0 points, just out there running some ghost routes on the other side. But I think that would be the biggest concern. Like, can he hold up to that kind of volume? But I think he's that archetype. I don't think he's Kenny Galladay. I think he's closer to a Brandon Marshall lineage than he is Kenny Galladay.
has actually dealt with a hamstring injury of some sorts, some more severe than others, but every single season since 2019, Dwain. So even going back to some of those later Clemson years out there. So again, you mentioned before, where we kind of be ranking him if he does end up with the Patriots. Had my way too early, wide receiver ranks and tiers go out. You guys can go back and listen to that episode if you prefer. But looking again, more so at that borderline wide receiver 1 range, had Terry McLaurin, wide receiver 11, Lab McConkey, wide receiver 12, JSN, Tyreek Hill, and Mike Evans rounding out the top 15. Again, this could change depending on who's going to be joining those teams as well. But I do think, Dwain, once you get to the Mike Evans, Zay Flowers, Cortland Sutton, that feels like the right spot to me. Maybe not top 12, but really think it's going to be a hard time getting more than 15 or 16 guys ahead of him. So more than anything, just again, please do help out Drake Maye Patriots. This was the league's single worst supporting cast when looking at the average PFF team grades, rushing, receiving, pass blocking, and run blocking. Again, just everything other than pure throwing the football. So have all that cap space and also have, 5 picks here inside the top 104 overall picks. So even if it's not T. Higgins, let's go ahead and try to get some real wide receivers in there because Lord knows Jalen Polk and Javon Baker didn't exactly work out the way anyone was hoping for in 2024. So please, Patriots, wide receiver for Drake Maye and T. Higgins will be pretty cool. Let's move on, Dwain, to our Cowboys. Certainly was a season to forget in 2024, although injuries, certainly have plenty to go with that. However, as good as Rico Dowdle was, it was a season where you just couldn't help but wonder what this offense could have looked like, maybe with a more true workhorse baller there as the team's RB1. So from Cowboys fans, dear Jerry Jones, make up for your, let's face it, brutal head coaching hire by drafting Ashton Jeanty. What say you, Dwain?
Well, I think Schottenheimer would like that. I think he wants to pound the rock more. I think this is more of, love fantasy managers, probably more so than love Cowboys fans. If I'm running the Cowboys, I don't think Jeanty would be my pick. And I love Ashton Jeanty. Like, this dude is phenomenal. We'll be talking about it more as we talk about, a lot of these rookie prospects. I just wrapped up working on the rookie supermodel for running backs about a week ago. And Jeanty came out in the top 5 that I've graded since 2017, just above Jahmyr Gibbs, below Bijan Robinson, Saquon Barkley, Christian McCaffrey, right there with Leonard Fournette. So he's a really good player. And that's after accounting for, his strength of schedule, which is the one concern you have with a guy like Jeanty. Didn't play against the premier talent that some of the other guys played against that are coming out in this class. But otherwise, man, just a well-rounded back, not an elite receiving back, but a good receiving back, Ian. But man, as far as like his prowess on the ground and what he can do as a rusher, like this guy came out in the 100th percentile for his career grade for PFF rush grade. So yeah, if the Cowboys could get him, we would love it because there's a clear path to him being the bell cow back. This is a guy that's shown that he could do that in college, has big playability, man, came out 80th percentile in yards after contact for his career, 95th percentile in missed tackles forced per attempt. So a very, very slippery player. You give this guy 350 opportunities on a decent offense, which I think the Cowboys will be, there's a chance he finishes as the running back 1 overall. And that's not being hyperbolic. That's not, just trying to, put out here, a headline to get people to click on something. He really could be the running back 1 overall in Dallas. Now, again, if I'm the Cowboys and I'm running the team, I think there's plenty of other needs, and I think there are other backs you could get later in the they're not Jeanty by any means, but I think we've seen you don't have to have the elite running back to win. Yeah, it can be the cherry on the top when you're the freaking Eagles, right? You got a great offensive line, defensive line, everything else is already working for you. But if he does go there, all we care really about is fantasy, and Ashton Jeanty immediately is in the top 6 running back conversation on a team like the Cowboys where he takes over that running back 1 spot.
Cowboys certainly need a running back or 2. Right now they have the third fewest $25 devoted to the position. Rico Dowdle hitting free agency and all that. But I'm with you. If anything, Dwain, it might be time to party like it's the 2010s again and start getting some more high round offensive linemen back in the picture. I know they've done, not exactly ignored the group over the years, but let's face it, that core of, Travis Frederick, Tyron Smith, and now free agent to be Zach Martin could be completely out the door here as we get into 2025. Overall, last season, Cowboys running backs ranked 31st in terms of yards before contact per carry. Sometimes that is a bit more of a vision issue, but again, in Dallas right now, really do think it would behoove them to invest some more resources in the big uglies up front, because as great as Jeanty is, Dwain, my goodness, I'm not going to pretend to be, the next Dane Brugler of the world here or anything, but every single draft pundit just seems to be speaking so highly about the overall depth of this class. Mel Kiper says there's 33 running backs with draftable grades. I know, Dwayne, you've been in the workshop here the last couple of weeks working on your RB super model. Look, Jeanty, RB1, that's all fine and dandy. But just overall, from 1 to 15, from 1 to 20, is this a much deeper class than what we've seen in past years?
It really is. And I mean, if you like size and speed together, and we'll get more information from the combine, but this class is loaded, man. There are so many guys that are 215, 225 pounds that can run. Now, they don't all have the same feel and the same ability to break tackles and do all these other things that Jeanty does, but they could be good enough if you put them behind a good offensive line, or if you want to create more of a tandem rushing attack, that sort of thing. But yeah, there is a nice group of, I'm not going to allow this class probably as highly as some people, but it definitely is a deep class. Last year, it was more at wide receiver where we had all the depth. I do think this year running back is going to be the position for the skill positions of running back, wide receiver, tight end that we feel the best about, even as far as when we get into day 2 and even possibly some day 3 picks, depending on where they land. So yeah, I am with you. And the Cowboys, you talked about the offensive line. The other thing is Tyler Guyton, man, he was a bust last year. Maybe he can turn around and come back. That's their first round pick last year, their left tackle, but it was not good. He dealt with some injuries or different things that going on. But man, he graded out as the 73rd offensive tackle out of 81 qualifiers over at PFF. So even though you spent that first round pick, you got to be wondering right now if Tyler Guyton is going to be a miss. I think obviously Tyler Smith 2 years ago, their guard, he's really good. I think they hit on that one. BB is a guy that they just grabbed out of nowhere at center. He came on pretty good, even though they let Biotish go. He did well for the Commanders. So, but to your mention, Zach Martin gone. You lose Tyron Smith last year. I'm with you. I like the idea of going with the offensive line, and you got a deeper running back class here.
12th overall pick, and they got the 44th pick in the second round, then the 76th pick in the third round. Then the Cowboys don't have a pick until 150th, in round 5. So that could change with some comp picks and stuff going on, but that's just where things stand right now. So yeah, I don't have a problem with using that 12th overall pick on offensive tackle, and then maybe looking at one of those Ohio State running backs in round 2, maybe even round 3. Heck, I mean, we're talking about 10 potential players between round 2 and round 4 that Dane Brugler thinks could go off the board, at that position. So we'll see what goes on in Dallas. But man, if we've learned anything through the Zeke, through the Tony Pollard, and even Rico Dowdle years at this point, whoever is going to be the RB1 in that Cowboys offense should certainly be high on our radar. And if it happens to be Ashton Jeanty, yeah, I mean, legit RB1 overall upside would be a fun time for fantasy managers indeed. Let's move on to a other position, Dwayne, because we got some pretty good tight ends sitting here in this class. 2 specifically ones might be going in round 1. So what better team to maybe invest in one than the crowd that cannot stop crying out for their joker. So from Bo Nix, dear Broncos, forget chocolate. I want Penn State tight end Tyler Warren for Valentine's Day. So Dwayne, I know you haven't dove too far into this tight end class just yet, but man, when you look at Warren fresh off 1,000+ yard season, and we got Colson Loveland in there as well, who both Thor Nystrom and Matthew Friedman have mocked to Denver. Just whoever it is, wide receiver, tight end, maybe even a friendly running back, let's get Bo Nix some more high-quality pass catchers and see what happens.
Yeah, for Tyler Warren, he's really interesting. I like him. I do wonder if people are just, sniffing glue a little bit coming off of, we just had the Brock Bowers, you had Laporta, the year before. I don't think he's quite in the same class as those guys. And again, I'm early in working on the model. Basically, all I have is where we were with the model from last year. I just started putting the tight ends in yesterday. He really didn't break out until his 5th year. Now we're going to look at year 1, and this is kind of a weird, I'm honestly ready for this 5-year span to be over, because COVID kind of messes up everything. And then you got the transfer portal with everybody moving all over the place. We're probably gonna have to reset our priors at some point about these guys and age and how much we care about it in the model. But, Warren, that was his 5th year at Penn State, and he really didn't do much until that year. So I think that is one potential negative that I do worry about. Now, it was a great season, but I could also look at a guy like Colson Loveland, who in his 3rd year did what Tyler Warren did in his 5th year. Coming out of Michigan. So I know we're not allowed to talk about them on the program here, Ian. So sorry. It's only supposed to be Ohio State Buckeyes or bust. But Loveland is another guy. He's going later in NFL drafts, mock drafts. So I think I like him just as much. And again, I don't want this to be a knock against Tyler Warren. Again, guys, I do think he's one of the top tight ends in the class. I do wonder, though, is he going to get pushed up draft boards too much because we just had this freak named Brock Bowers come out and really change the landscape again? And the NFL does this. They're not they're not, beyond having an overreaction to the thing that just worked. And I worry a little bit. I like Tyler Warren. I do like him here. I like your idea of him being the joker that they can move around. I think he could be good in that position. He had like 30 rushing attempts in college as well, Ian. So he's a versatile player. Like, he's a more versatile player than Colston Loveland. But if you're just looking for a guy that you could line up and get out there all the time, I think Loveland might actually be the better prospect. Again, very early in my work. My main thing with Warren is, I think this would be a good fit, but I do wonder, is he getting steamed a little bit because of Brock Bowers?
This has the feeling of almost the Marvin Harrison Jr. versus Malik Neighbors thing from last year, where even people that prefer one or the other, they're both going to have them as top 10, top 15, maybe in this case, prospects. Specifically, hey, Dane Brugler over at The Athletic just published his top 100, just overall big board here the last couple of days. He does have Tyler Warren 10th and Colston Loveland right there behind him at 11th. So I will say with Warren, because you're right, didn't do much early on in his career at Penn State. As we know, though, with the Nittany Lions, really has become a bit of a tight end factory over the years. And man, Pat Fryer with Brenton Strange, Zach Kuntz, and then Theo Johnson, all guys that were in that tight end room before. So one of those situations where, again, at a bigger school, just 1, 4, 5-star recruit after another, bit tougher to get on the field. So at least we did finally get that boom out of Warren. And yeah, man, you do talk about that versatility. Tons of snaps, pretty much as the Wildcat quarterback, and even caught a touchdown against USC where he was the one snapping the ball in the first place. So with the Broncos now specifically, they've only used 2 top 100 picks on tight ends since the 2015 season. Now there's any more on the roster in terms of, Noah Fant over in Seattle, and then Greg Dulcich, who just, really tried to make happen over the years, but couldn't quite get there. So Courtland Sutton, I think at this point, we all agree he can be a legit wide receiver 1. That's what he's been over these past 2 seasons. But again, receiving RB, some more wide receivers, or maybe just maybe that shiny Tyler Warren in round 1 would be great stuff for Bo Nix. I know, Dwayne, we were talking about quarterbacks and, who we could really see being that, QB6, QB7 after that tier break. Bo Nix was someone that you shouted out, and for good reason, man, coming off, I believe, the 5th most fantasy points per game by a rookie in NFL history. I mean, if we did just have to kind of reset, what one of the biggest lessons we learned in 2024 is that Sean Payton still got it, man, and he might just found himself as long-term quarterback as well.
Yeah, for sure, man. I mean, Bo Nix looked amazing, and they were really doing this with just Courtland Sutton. I have more concerns about him regressing downward versus what we just talked about with T. Higgins, right? But they did a lot with him, and then really just Marvin Mims was honestly a gadget player. And it was those 2 guys that carried the whole passing offense, because Troy Franklin ultimately never really did anything. Devon Valet, like we talked about, I know it's Valet, but I can't get over the Art Vandelay thing here. He loves architecture. But looking at, the guys that they did this with, if you add something like Warren, it would definitely be, an upgrade. And Bo Nix did look really good last year. And he's one of these guys, sneaky dual threat, man. It would have surprised us if Bo Nix came out and threw for 4,500 yards and then tacked on 500 rushing. That's in the range of outcomes for this guy if they can upgrade the passing game weapons.
Bo Nix, Tyler Warren, Courtland Sutton, maybe Marvin Mims really gets going again. Who knows? You could imagine what it'd be like, though, if that all happens. So 7th fewest dollars devoted to tight ends for the Broncos ahead of 2025. If it's not going to be Warren or Colston, maybe they can dip into free agency. But man, Dwayne, the free agency class as a whole is not great, and tight end might be, the roughest of the bunch. We're talking about Tyler Conklin, Jawan Johnson, Mike Gesicki as the potential, jewels, if you will, of that group. So not great over there, but hey, maybe some great matchmaker spots we still got to get to. Right after a quick word to our friends over at New Era. Celebrate the Eagles' 2nd Lombardi trophy with New Era Cap. Philly earned a return to the biggest stage, and boy, did they deliver. Wear what the players wear during confetti showers and honor their championship with the official cap of the Super Bowl champions. Available now from New Era Cap. Also invite you guys to check out Fantasy Life, Twitter, Instagram, all that stuff, because over the course of Super Bowl weekend, Radio Row, Kendall Valenzuela and company, great job just covering everything, but also had these limited edition New Era caps that aren't even available yet, but will be displayed on draft night. So very cool early look at some of those. And yeah, just shout out New Era, always hooking us up with some freshness. So appreciate you guys and appreciate the Raiders. Maybe it's taking a step in the right direction, trying to win some football games again. Obviously, Tom Brady doing everything in his power to make that happen. Pete Carroll and company as well. Chip Kelly now sitting there as the OC. But Dwain, let's face it, hard to win football games without a great quarterback. And while I don't think there's necessarily a great quarterback for the Raiders to get, in the draft or even free agency, I do think a reunion of sorts could perhaps get them a little bit closer to that above average line. So from the Raiders, dear Derek Carr, I'm sorry for all I've done. Take me back. You buying it, Dwain?
I thought this was going to be from you to Derek Carr saying, will he unblock you on Twitter? But, I don't know what you did to this man at some point, because I think I've said, I try not to be mean, but I've definitely said some derogatory things about Derek Carr, and he never blocked me. So I'm still wondering what you said that got him so hot under the collar. But looking at Derek Carr, I guess my question is, like, I do agree. Like, if he came here and you've got Brock Bowers, you've got Jacoby Myers, maybe they do something else at wide receiver in the NFL draft or in free agency, you could certainly be dealing with some weapons that you like. They've got some offensive linemen. The left side of their offensive line, pretty good, with Colston Miller ranking 13th out of 81 tackles per PFF. And then you look at the guard position also doing well there. So I just look at a situation where, yeah, Derek Carr could come in and probably be fine for helping us in fantasy. But I do wonder, like, what's the motivation, for a team like the Raiders, who've been really bad, and you might as well just go ahead and like finish off being bad and like continue on and continue getting better and better draft capital and trying to pile on as many picks until you get that true difference making quarterback. I just wonder, like, what's the motivation to get a guy like Derek Carr? Do we really think it's going to make enough difference for you to compete with the Chiefs in that division? I mean, maybe it is. Maybe they do have the weapons that would allow that. But I think it's just one of those scenarios when I look at it from an NFL perspective, it's hard for me to get too excited. From a fantasy perspective, again, I do think it would be fine. I think Derek Carr would be good enough that we could feel good about Bowers as well as Jacoby Myers. I mean, heck, we felt good about both of those guys last year. Even when we had Aiden O'Connell, Gardner, both those guys had some really bad games, but they also had plenty of good games. Like, these weren't guys that we were ever really saying, hey, you got to bench them because either one of these other guys are playing. And I do think that Derek Carr gives you a more steady option than those two, right? I think he's honestly not that far above them as far as what we would expect for like his totals on the year, but I think you get a little bit more consistency out of him, which would be nice for the pass catchers.
And look, I'm not trying to sit here and say Derek Carr is going to be a top 10 quarterback going back to the Raiders or anything, but I also will push back at the idea that he's this, complete liability out there. I mean, if we wanted to have, the kind of the spectrum of Kirk Cousins-esque quarterbacks, he's there. I'm not saying that, during his prime, he was as good as Kirk Cousins, but, we just saw what can happen to someone like Sam Darnold when he's actually propped up by some good pass catchers and a great system. Not saying that Carr is even as talented as Sam Darnold. I don't think he has the same level of arm talent, but man, Dwain, when we do look at, certain metrics from last season, I'm old enough to remember weeks 1 through 2 where this dude was absolutely slinging it, with Kubiak setting him up nicely. And just over the course of the season, despite playing behind that injury-riddled offensive line, despite not having really any high-end wide receivers to throw to that were consistently healthy. I love you, Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed, but they missed a lot of time out there. We're talking about the league's 8th best quarterback and adjusted EPA per dropback when accounting for line play and drops and things of that nature. So the Raiders, man, they have some of the highest available cap space in the league, and the Saints are just so screwed at this point, and Carr does not want to take a pay cut, which we can all understand that. I do wonder if we could get almost that Jared Goff-esque trade where the Raiders actually get a draft pick and Derek Carr to basically just take his salary and provide some relief for New Orleans. Because again, it just comes down to if they're not going to be able to get a Shedeur Sanders or a Cam Ward and they just want to kind of punt and start, trying to tank for Arch Manning or get whoever they can in 2026 and beyond, Derek Carr could be, a decent enough stopgate for him. So we did want to talk to you, Dwain, because again, we're going to do a kind of full what happened with the coaching carousel episode here within the next couple of weeks. No major rush, but with Chip Kelly coming to this situation, was a guy where, last time in the NFL wasn't too great, but he does check a lot of those boxes that we like to see in terms of the tempo, in terms of all the motion. And I do just wonder, man, having a guy who's going to be able to get this running game in a good spot, not ask that much of Derek Carr. Again, I don't think Carr himself is going to become this fantasy super duper star, but Brock Bowers, Jacoby Myers, hopefully another pass catcher out there. I think there could be worse situations here. No, they're not going to compete with the Chiefs, but would it be completely shocking to you with Derek Carr in Vegas if they could be, I don't know, the 16th or 17th best offense in terms of points scored?
Well, I mean, yeah, we saw Derek Carr do that just a few seasons ago with the Raiders, So I think he's, to your point, like he's a top 30, he's a top 32 quarterback in the NFL. He's probably a top 25, right? I mean, he's right there. The NFL is just this major league of haves and have-nots, and there are only so many Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen types out there, right? Joe Burrow's in that mix. Other names I know I'm not mentioning here, guys. You got 5 or 6 dudes that are like the guys. And then you've got really a big group of guys that could do it if they had the right supporting cast. You had a great example with Sam Darnold. There's obviously tiers within those players, but I do think that Derek Carr falls somewhere along that spectrum, to your point. So could you catch lightning in a bottle? You get the offense working right. You bring in Chip Kelly. Obviously, he's going to want to, run the ball. He's going to be a guy that's going to want to be balanced. Probably won't see quite as much tempo as we used to. He even came out and was talking about how he's kind of changed his mind on that, and how he also had to change play designs for the hashes. He said that was the biggest difference coming from college to the NFL, that if he had to go back and do it again, that he would have made major adjustments for the hashes, which in the NFL are closer to the center of the field for you guys that aren't familiar with it, and they are closer to the outside of the field in college. So whenever you spot the ball, that makes a difference, and where you're setting up and what your play might look like. So it does sound like he learned from his time in the NFL before. So I think that Chip Kelly could do some really innovative things. This is a guy that was a very innovative way back in the day at Oregon. Like you said, didn't work quite as well at the NFL, but it sounds like he's learned some things. So I actually like this. I do like the signing of Chip Kelly. I also think that what he would do is give Derek Carr some easy buttons to push, right? I think he's going to use the motion. I think he's going to use the stuff to confuse the defense right before the snap. I think he's going to get play action involved. I think he will use tempo when he needs to. So I think you have the potential for a coordinator that does know how to dial up the right things when you need them, which is really critical for a player like Derek Carr, a player like Jared Goff, which we saw, benefit so much over these last few years from A, having all these playmakers around him, and then B, having a guy like Ben Johnson knowing the right times to push these buttons and how to sequence things and set up big plays later in the game. I do think that Chip Kelly can do some of those things.
It is funny how obsessed, some of these offensive minds in college are with the hash marks. I mean, I know Joel Klatt had an interview at Ryan Day last season before the year and was like, if you could be college football commissioner for a day, what'd be the one thing you'd change? And it was the hash marks and getting them more consistent with the NFL. So just goes to show some of the different things these dudes are thinking about. But yes, whether it's Derek Carr, again, Cam Ward, Shedeur Sanders, whoever, please just try something else, because right now, Dwain, over the last 2 seasons, Raiders currently employ 3 of the bottom 10 quarterbacks in EPA per dropback in Gardner Minshew, Aiden O'Connell, and yes, even Desmond Ridder. So not great. Not saying Derek Carr is going to make them great, but certainly would be closer than where they are right now. Let's talk about that quarterback that, again, I mentioned a few minutes ago as someone who got propped up by a great supporting cast. And yes, Sam Darnold staying in Minnesota, probably best for him, but perhaps another reunion could be in the fold. Dwain, from the Jets, dear Sam Darnold, maybe now we really can live happily ever after. Aaron Glenn's in town, changing the culture, telling Aaron Rodgers he can't be going on Pat McAfee's show anymore. Seems like that is going to be the end of that relationship. So with Darnold, again, not a given he leaves Minnesota, but if you did have to go ahead and rank all these free agent quarterbacks, Dwain, pretty easy to see Darnold at the top of the list.
Well, I mean, what we saw from Darnold last year is, like, if you put him with a good play caller, you get the players around him, he can deliver the big plays down the field. And that was really his calling card last year, Ian. And that's whenever he and Jordan Addison found their connection, that is what truly opened up the Vikings offense. Justin Jefferson, he was doing his thing the whole time, right? So Justin Jefferson was always a key cog. But once they got to where Jordan Addison was also that secondary component and they were able to hit a lot of big plays with him, that just changed the nature of the Vikings offense. And so it would be very interesting to see how this works out if he were to return to the Jets. It's funny, we've got 2 potential reunions here, with Darnold to the Jets and then Carr back to the Raiders. But look, we're probably going to have Devontae Adams gone. Like, his cap hit is very big. And with Aaron Rodgers gone, I don't know that they'll want to keep him. Nothing against Devontae Adams, dude. Dude balled out last year. I mean, coming in and doing the things he did, even though you had Garrett Wilson opposite you, I think Adams showed that, yeah, while he may be older, this is a guy that's still playing at a very high level. Maybe not quite at his prime, but he has not fallen off a cliff by any means. So it'll be interesting to see what they decide to do with that contract. But if you did keep Devontae Adams and you have Garrett Wilson with Sam Darnold, I think that could be something where we could get pretty excited about, because a lot of things we had hoped for with Aaron Rodgers, I think at this point we would have to say Sam Darnold probably could do with the Jets. Now, it does come down to Can you have an offensive coordinator that can pull the strings like what we saw with Kevin O'Connell, obviously coach of the year? This is a guy that, we thought a lot about, and we thought a lot about what his scheme opened up, for the Vikings. So that would be the one thing that would still be, a concern. If you look at the Jets overall, like offensive line graded out pretty well. That's something you would also have to make sure you have intact. That was the biggest challenge still with Sam Darnold. Man, when he would get under pressure, complete meltdowns. I mean, getting into the red zone, throwing things that just major throws you shouldn't be making into heavy coverage. Those turn things from being touchdowns into picks, and often the other team going to score points. Those are major swings in games. Obviously, the Vikings still had a really good record, but that would be something you would have to do. Because if you go back to his days before with the Jets, I think the thing I look at is you could trace a lot of this back to the pressure that he faced. And everybody remembers the seeing ghosts and things like that. You have to make sure you've got the offensive line, just locked down for Sam Darnold, because I think he is one of these guys that if you don't do that, if you leave that step out, I don't think he can overcome it like some of the best quarterbacks in the league that just make up for having a bad offensive line. I think we've seen enough from Sam Darnold to know that if you put him in that kind of situation, it's probably not going to end well.
And honestly, that was one of the more surprising parts of the Aaron Rodgers experience last year. Like, it was really bad overall, but even then you saw most of his numbers, I don't know, between 16th and 20th, more stats than not. The one area where he really, really sucked, though, was actually straight dropbacks with no pressure. Clean pockets, and he still just couldn't get the job done. We're talking about down there with Will Levis and, Cooper Rush and guys like that in terms of some of the more advanced statistics like EPA and completion percentage over expected, amongst others. So that really is where Darnold can thrive. And yeah, Dwain, I do wonder if Davante Adams, has enough trust in Darnold to maybe stay in town, or the Jets can rework his contract, because it is going to be a pretty big cap hit if that comes to fruition. So honestly, maybe Derek Carr going to the Jets could be a situation where Davante is going to be happy about it. Obviously, going back to Fresno State, and they had that one great year together with the Raiders. So overall, man, I just hope the Jets can actually get a good quarterback for the first time in, I don't know, forever, pretty much, man. Like, it has been so bad. Just looking at passer rating, which again, not the best stat as a one, be all end all for a quarterback, but what stat is a good, just single representation for any player. But passer rating does do a good job, just yards, weighted touchdowns, interceptions, of kind of summing up an entire passing game. And from 2020 to 2024, Jets are 32nd. 2010 to 2019, 31st, 2000, 2009 at 21st. In the 90s, they were 24th. Again, last year, I don't think anyone watched the Jets offense and was like, wow, just what a juggernaut passing attack. And they weren't. They were 18th in passer rating. That was the team's fourth best single season mark ever, and their single highest mark since 2002. The 2024 Jets, that was their best passing offense in over 20 years. And it's really sad that, again, we are now going through that. So hopefully getting Rodgers out of town is going to be enough to keep Garrett Wilson happy. We had some of those trade rumors swirling. Not exactly sure how hyped he would be about Darnold, but again, really don't have anywhere to go.
Rodgers to the Vikings, Ian. He follows Brett Favre's footsteps. Goes from the Packers to the Jets to the Vikings, and then we get the same thing from Aaron Rodgers, and he turns it all back on with Kevin O'Connell. I think we could see that.
But no, I mean, come on, like, it's just the McCarthy show, right? Like, it'd be funny. I just
want to upset Thor. Thor's all in on McCarthy, so I just want to see him short circuit, with Aaron Rodgers in town to give him a run for the starting job.
I'm down for that, honestly. And look, I love Thor, but I had to mute the man. I can only take so many J.J. McCarthy, Michigan Wolverines highlights. All right, Dwain? I'm trying to enjoy the last couple months in Columbus, Ohio, and Thor's just bringing up these demons every single time I go over on the old Twitter sphere. So we'll see what happens in New York. Going to need to be some sort of quarterback. And again, I know Carr isn't exactly a free agent right now, but between Carr and Sam Darnold, those are the two non-rookies that I do think probably give at least the pass catchers involved the best chance of making some noise. So new offensive coordinator Tanner Engstrand. We'll work on that. Lions pass game coordinator last year, been with the team since 2020. So hopefully hung around Ben Johnson enough to, help elevate this, the scheme involved with this offense. But otherwise, could use someone like, again, Darnold or Carr with that downfield arm strength to at least maybe unlock a new part of Garrett's game. So good stuff at the quarterback position. But as we mentioned in both cases, Dwain, tough to expect too much out of a quarterback without a pretty good offensive line. And I don't think anyone can attest to that more than Seahawks fans over the years. So I think I speak for all of Seattle, specifically Geno Smith and Kenneth Walker, when we say, dear Seahawks, I deserve more than the pennies you spent on the offensive line, because It really is damning at this point, Dwayne. The performance speaks for itself, all right? Last year, PFF's 31st ranked overall unit, 30th in rushing yards before contact per carry, 29th in pressure rate allowed. And you look at this sometimes and there's a bunch of injuries, and not saying the Seahawks were completely devoid of that. They did have their also starting center retire halfway through the season, which is, pretty tough to overcome. But just year over year, man, they've just largely declined to spend any sort of resources on this group. They're 30th in 2025 dollars devoted to the just overall offensive line. And man, over the last 8 drafts combined, Seattle has used one top 50 pick on their offensive line. So look, Geno, I think has actually done a pretty great job, having a relatively low pressure to sack rate, working his way through progressions. And Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet, man, it's one of those things where when you look at their overall rushing numbers, they're not great, but we mentioned it, the offensive line isn't helping. When you start looking at the tackles avoided and the yards after contact per carry, one of the better, just duos in the league in terms of that. So honestly, I'm fine with Geno. I'm fine with Walker, Charbs, Metcalf, JSN. Lockett's probably out of the picture. Everything on the offense is fine except that gaping hole up the middle. So let's try to fix it.
Yeah, probably gonna have to do it through the draft. 4th least available cap space for the Seahawks. Obviously, we've got some moves coming, with Lockett and things like that. We'll see what they can end up doing. As far as freeing some dollars up, there are some nice players available in free agency on the offensive line. You got Ronnie Stanley, from the Ravens. He's still a player that's, not young anymore, but still good enough in his prime. You're sitting here looking at Trey Smith. Obviously, that would be a huge one if Kansas City let him get away. Only 25 years old, one of the best guards in the league. I don't think the Seahawks are going to be able to be in on those players. I think they're probably going to have to try to address this in the NFL draft. That probably means if they could spend a first-round pick on a guy that they like, maybe a second or a third as well. I'm with you. I would like to see them spend a couple of different draft picks. I will say Charles Cross, he stepped up big time from where he played as a rookie. This last year, he graded out as the 9th overall tackle out of 81 qualifiers per PFF. So he took that step forward. So at least you feel like you got one piece. You've got one piece that you can potentially depend on. Now, can you add at least another 2 pieces? Maybe they could do something cheaper in free agency with maybe an older veteran willing to take a little bit of a cheaper contract in on a 1-year deal to upgrade one of the other spots. But they're going to have to get pretty innovative given their cap situation. It does look like it would have to mostly be through the NFL draft.
Obviously, do now have a new OC who I think we can be excited about. Clint Kubiak making his way to Seattle from New Orleans last year. Had a press conference, I believe, yesterday, actually, and just talking about Kenneth Walker. Did have a quote saying, looking forward to him in the scheme, and we're going to ask a lot out of him. So Mike McDonald last year when he got there basically was also saying the same thing, like he is going to be our workhorse running back. Now, Zach Charbonnet certainly made the most out of his opportunities. But, Dwayne, this was a situation where I know I was a little bit down on Walker because I just thought maybe new coaching staff, Charbonnet is going to have a situation to maybe just, again, bring to life, I think, more what the play caller is looking for. As great as Kenneth Walker is, just aesthetically, running style, nobody makes 5 yards look more fun than Kenneth Walker out here, okay? He is a very good football player with the ball in his hands, but I was a little bit behind you. I started to get back on track in August, and man, by week 4 or week 5, like we were talking about a legit top 5 running back in fantasy. Some injuries got in the way, but just seeing McDonald be willing to, I guess, let the offense be turned over to Walker. Is this a situation, Dwayne, where if we get that similar, round 4, round 5, RB 16 to 20 ADP, we want to bet big on Walker again?
Yeah, I think he's still young enough, right, that he's in that prime window of his career, could have, one of these monster seasons. It does come down to what's the workload going to look like. You do have to wonder now, this coaching staff, obviously you got the new OC here, but you got McDonald back. He has seen a year of trying to load up Walker and him getting hurt multiple times in the season. Does that change the way he really thinks about it? I read those quotes, and while I thought they were encouraging, hey, we're going to ask a lot of him, but they're probably going to say that out of a lot of players. We're going to ask a lot of them. We're going to ask them to know. We're going to ask them to know the playbook. Oh, thanks. Awesome. This is a great quote. Like, it would have been interesting to really see, and I haven't been able to go back and comb through like all the other questions that were asked. Sometimes of these standalone comments, like, really bugs me the way they get positioned by certain accounts on Twitter. Because what would they say about Zach Charbonnet when you ask them about him? Like, they're probably going to say a bunch of positive stuff about him as well. So definitely worth watching. Definitely worth, to your point, Ian, noting the fact that we did see Kenneth Walker play so well last year. The biggest thing to remember, and what got me on Kenneth Walker last year, wasn't that I just thought he was going to dominate the backfield. He's a really good player. And it sounded like there was a possibility that he could. So I do feel like we're still in the same ballpark of the conversation as knowing that could be a potential outcome for him. So as long as that ADP doesn't steam too much on a comment like this, then yeah. And that's the big thing, really. Last year, you're like, young player has looked really good. People were letting him fall in around 5 and 6 of fantasy drafts. Yes, I just want to draft that player. And it was as simple as that. But suddenly you tell me that I have to take Kenneth Walker in round 3 with Zach Charbonnet sitting behind him, Kenneth Walker's injury history. We do have a new offensive coordinator. Then I think there are enough red flags to say, okay, like really, we're going to invest in Kenneth Walker in round 3. So ADP will really be key for me. And right now it is lower. Like Kenneth Walker's not a guy going in the top 3 rounds. So I think he's fine to be drafting. But if these sort of comments end up steaming him up, which we've seen that it can really happen, then that changes the way we think about it a little bit, in my opinion.
I will say the one thing that really enticed me with Walker, again, if you want to rank him or outside the top 15 fantasy running backs, because of how many workhorses kind of emerged last season, like you can kind of get behind that. But if we had to say, okay, who are our top 5 running backs who could realistically break off like 5 or more 50-plus yard touchdowns during a season, you're going to have Saquon, you got Jonathan Taylor, and guess what, guys? Kenneth Walker is not going to be too far behind. I mean, who's got, better one-hitter quitter potential, Kyron Williams and Joe Mixon or Kenneth Walker? I'm going with KWIII 8 days of the week. So again, not having a ton of, spending available isn't going to help the cause here for fixing that offensive line. But Seahawks do have pick 18, pick 50, and pick 82. Let's use at least 2 of those on the big uglies up front and see what happens. So good stuff there. Do want to talk about some wide receivers next, but first a quick word from our friends over at Bud Light.
Hey, you're not actually allowed to drink in a beer commercial?
Since when?
You gotta wait till it's done. Oh,
5,
4, 3, 2, 1.
Cracks me up. Dear Panthers, a real wide receiver 1 in Stephon Diggs would make my heart flutter. Sincerely, Mr. Bryce Young. So look, in terms of Diggs, Amari Cooper, probably not Deontay Johnson, let's be honest. I think he's probably burned a few too many bridges at this point. If you did want to look through, again, the more fantasy relevant positions in free agency, wide receiver is going to be your deepest class. And I understand Deontay didn't work out last season because, couldn't exactly get along with the locker room. We did see, especially with Andy Dalton under center, Dwain, a couple flashes in a wide receiver room that just needs that player who can line up outside, win against man coverage, and hopefully separate. Obviously, Diggs coming off that ACL injury. He is going to be 32 in November, so not a spring chicken at this point. But when I look at Diggs and Deontay Johnson, like they're similar archetype players. Obviously, Diggs has achieved far more in his career than Deontay, but I just think at this point in his career, Diggs is someone who you can actually look to kind of reset that idea, put him on one side, Xavier get on the other. Maybe Thielen's back in the slot. Maybe we got some cokeheads out there still, standing for our guy, Jalen Coker. Maybe we add another player, in round 2 or round 3 of the draft. But I do think a 1-year reasonable deal for someone like Stephon Diggs would help because Lord knows we got to get Bryce Young some more weapons here, man. I mean, looking at just ESPN's open score, great job, does a great job, I should say, of just helping quantify separation ability. Their wide receivers and tight ends last year averaged the single worst separation mark in the league. So Stephon Diggs, Carolina, Dwain, you in?
Yeah, the Carolina Panthers, number one, need to throw their draft plan when it comes to wide receivers in the trash. Like they don't know what they're doing. I have a feeling that is going to turn around. They've got some new leadership as far as looking at analytics and things like that. I think that there's going to be some improvement there. But man, the Leggett and Mingo picks were just wild. Like looking at the things that even just us as fantasy analysts, building out the supermodel look at, there's just so many red flags, and they just went back to the well on guys that were big. Players that didn't, break out till later in their careers, and we're kind of in the old archetype of what the NFL used to think wide receivers had to be. And not saying that those archetypes weren't ever good. Yeah, we got some Des Bryants and things out of that, but it's not all about having 6'3", 6'4" guys that are 225. It really helps in today's NFL to have guys that can separate at all levels of the field, and you can also work underneath because the way defenses are playing. And it really felt like the Panthers were stuck in yesteryear. And Leggett, sorry to say, looks like he's really fitting into that same bucket. Supermodel didn't like him. Still a young player. We'll give him a chance, right? He could still come around in this next season. But it would be interesting to see if they also are willing to go back to the well again in the draft if you really are all in on Bryce Young. I mean, is it someone like a Tet McMillan, something potentially like that? I know you mentioned round 2 or 3 pick. Wouldn't be surprised to see them potentially use a first-round pick, on a wide receiver. I guess a lot of it does come down to how do they feel about Jalen Coker as well as Leggett and this free agency class, where to your point, you could come in, get a 1-year deal for a guy, like Stephon Diggs. I think Amari Cooper, Amari Cooper got stuffed into this, part-time rotational role. The Bills were just silly for doing some of that. There's no way Amari Cooper wasn't one of the best wide receivers. It should have been on the field more for them, especially in a championship game. So I think Amari's another guy that could come in and play well. So I do think there are some options here. I'm with you. I wouldn't want to give any of these guys like a long-term contract because where they are from an age standpoint, but I do think they could come in and play well. I mean, you've already got Adam Thielen, who's an older guy. We'll see what happens there with him. So if I'm looking at another player, I guess Chris Godwin is the other one, Ian, but I do wonder, is there like too much overlap between him and Thielen's game, right? Because really when Chris Godwin's at his best, and obviously he's coming off an injury, he's working inside, he's working underneath the coverage. You can still play him outside, but ultimately his routes, he's best when he gets to work underneath the coverage and break inside. So I do wonder with a guy like Chris Godwin, that's the other name we could mention. But to your point, we know that Stephon Diggs is a guy that can still play outside. So can Amari Cooper. So those are probably the two better fits of veterans you could bring in on like a 1-year deal that we feel decent about for especially the potential of Bryce Young.
Interesting to see them not be more willing to have Adam Thielen around. I mean, you kind of saw that quote from him a couple of weeks ago about like, we'll see what happens. We're going to have to work through some contract numbers. And just when he's been healthy these last 2 years, like he's been a legit, wide receiver 2, if not wide receiver 1 out here in Fantasyland at least. So with Leggett, yes, he was a rookie and really was dealing with a laundry list of injuries, man. I'm looking at his, shout out draft sharks for keeping track of all this, but just injury history last year alone. And he missed part of OTAs with a hamstring issue. He had a foot bruise in August. In October, we had a shoulder injury, and then we had a groin pull all the way in December, had offseason wrist surgery as well. So Leggett very banged up, but all that said, man, really did seem to run pretty well. I think we can say overall, just in terms of Deontay leaving town, Thielen missing a large chunk of the season, and just, again, the group of rookie wide receivers. Yes, we'll see a few exceptions here, but if they can't gain even 500 yards in the season, man, really has been far more misses than hits out here. So I'm with you. I do think Amari Cooper could be a nice bounce back. And, maybe Diggs isn't going to be the answer depending on when he's going to be even available from that ACL injury. But just one of these guys overall, man, would be much appreciated for all these Bryce Young stands out there who, lest we forget, guys, like really did have a great stretch run. I mean, I'm sure Panthers fans are going to be watching that Week 18 film against the Falcons all off season long, and for good reason. But overall, guys, once Bryce got his job back in Week 8, only Joe Burrow had more big time throws per PFF. So Bryce was out there doing his thing. He's got Dave Canales saying he is their quarterback and everything. So let's go ahead and take advantage of that rookie contract and actually get some good pass catchers out there. So again, Stephon Diggs, we'll see what happens. But before he did get injured, Dwain, this was a player that still looked more than fine. I mentioned that open score metric before. He was 7th among all wide receivers last year in terms of that separation ability. Pretty good if you ask me. So Bryce Young for you, Dwain, like looking like someone who's going to be outside the top 20 quarterbacks still most likely in fantasy. Like if we had to say, kind of quarterback, disappointing, matchmaker, Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, Caleb Williams, which one would you be a bit more willing to maybe invest in moving forward?
I think I'm still leaning towards Caleb Williams out of that group just because we've seen the absolute monster big playability. Now, he can't do any of the other things so far. So hopefully they can get him reined in so we're not having all the negative plays. Sorry, producer swing, not trying to be negative here on Caleb. But notice, I did pick Caleb out of that group because I just think that he still has the most raw talent that you could potentially harness. If I was to pick one of those players, Ian, that I would say, man, in 2 years, they surprise us and they're in the conversation, with the Josh Allens, the guys like that, Patrick Mahomes. I still think that's Caleb Williams. But to your point, like that's not dismissing CJ Stroud. That's not dismissing Bryce Young. I still put Bryce Young at the bottom of this list because I think CJ, even though he had a bad second year, he still had a phenomenal year 1. So he's given us something, right, on the track record. So I think CJ Stroud's right there for me with Caleb Williams. And then you have Bryce Young below that. But again, that's not me trying to knock Bryce Young. I think you did a great job of laying out all the things that he did over the second half of the season, how well he played. That big time throw rate is actually huge because early in his career, he just wasn't willing to push the ball down the field. That was a major issue. And that's something in Alabama that we saw him do really great. And then you look at it and you're like, well, yeah, look at the receivers he had at Alabama. But this is a guy that did show in college that he could buy time. And when he got out of the pocket or he bought time in the pocket, it was to make the big throw down the field. And we saw more of that in the second half last year. So also encouraging. So I think there is a range of outcomes where we suddenly do see Bryce Young as being a guy that, is much closer to those other two in a couple of years from now. So I think right now I would still take the other two, but still want to make sure I acknowledge the fact that, yes, Bryce Young was a lot better last season and in the range of outcomes that he could be the best of the three. I know people are still going to be concerned about the size, but just what they've done on the field, I think there is still a chance of that.
Last Valentine from us, guys. And a lot of these have, again, been from the fans or maybe a quarterback hoping for a wide receiver. This one's a bit more of a plea from a veteran running back because Najee Harris wants to know, dear Chargers, why don't you let me be your workhorse RB in shining armor? So I'm sure Dwain Chargers fans not exactly jumping out of their seats at the prospects of signing Najee Harris. But again, if you had to just think of the sort of Greg Roman, Jim Harbaugh running back who you're going to feed 300 plus carries, maybe you can break some tackles. Maybe we could be looking at the next sort of David Montgomery, the good running back who doesn't look as good in a pretty bad offense, I think we can say, finds his way to a better organization and starts to thrive. Can we get behind the NFL's only running back with 4 consecutive 1,000-yard seasons here, Dwain?
Well, I do think that Jim Harbaugh and the coaching staff, they care about like an archetype of back. To your point, I think they do want a guy that is bigger, that can be physical. I don't know that they care as much about the explosive rush rate, those sort of things. They stuck with Frank Gore late in his career in San Francisco for a long time. So I think there's some potential. I think that this could occur. When you look at Najee Harris, availability is also key. I mean, he has had 307, 272, 255, and 263 attempts in his first 4 seasons. So not many backs, guys, that you can go out there and look that have been able to handle that sort of workload. That's something, Ian, you and I have talked about based on offseason research that we've done. There is something to these guys that they see they can put on the field in all these different situations and they can give the workload to, even if they don't always look the best from an efficiency standpoint, which is obviously a challenge for Najee Harris. You want to start talking about missed tackles forced per attempt. He's going to be closer to the league average. This last year, though, was his career year at 0.24 per attempt. So he showed a little bit more there. And then you look at his yards after contact, he's right around the NFL average. The NFL average over the last years is 3 years is 2.94. He's sitting there at 2.9. So doesn't necessarily take those physical traits and turn them into what we might think that could be. It doesn't translate that way on the NFL field, but I do think there is a potential fit here for a team that we know likes to get very physical at times. They want to establish it. They want to punish opposing defenders. I think that is something Najee Harris can do. Look, I'm just telling you right now, if I'm a cornerback and you give me a choice, like I've got to get Jahmyr Gibbs to the ground and I know he's the better player, or I've got to face Najee Harris, who's the lesser player, running straight at me, I'll take Jahmyr Gibbs. I'll take a shot. I may miss him. He may score a touchdown. But, man, it's going to be a violent situation when I've got to deal with trying to get Najee on the ground. And I think that's something that the Chargers value.
Might end up on a highlight a little bit quicker with Gibbs, but probably losing a few more brain cells there with Najee. So either way, going to need a running back in Los Angeles. J.K. Dobbins hitting free agency. And just last season, guys, Chargers RBs, 21st or worse in terms of yards after contact, missed tackles forced, and explosive run rate out there. So hope you guys enjoyed, again, our Valentines, hopefully nailing some of these offseason matches, but plenty more on the Fantasy Life Show the rest of the week. So I invite you guys to like, subscribe, do all that action, and we will see you next time. So for Dwain, for producer Matt, for producer Kelsey, I'm Ian. Thanks again for tuning in. And until next time, take care, everybody.